Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 10 class. We're in Unit 5, The Collapse of Empire, Section 2, Part A, Africa. We're specifically going to be looking at the initial independence movements in African nations, and then we're going to spend a deeper dive on apartheid and the collapse of the apartheid system in South Africa. Our self-test questions: what events precipitated the end of European imperialism in Africa? Like what are the historical circumstances around imperialism ending in Africa? What was apartheid? How was it ended? And what were the goals for South Africa following apartheid? 3, how does the legacy of European colonization affect the nations of Africa today? We'll be probably looking at that a little bit more next week. And 4, choosing 2 major issues facing African nations today, describe each issue in detail, including historical circumstances, effects, and attempts to solve the problem. And again, a little bit more of a focal point of the notes on Part B. So, what was going on when we last left off with our exploration of Africa and its relation to European colonial nations? Well, European nations, mostly France, Great Britain, and Belgium, though Germany had some colonies as well initially, they had basically conquered, taken over, annexed, however you want to word it, most of Africa. And they exploited Africa as a colony during the age of new imperialism. African colonies were used to gain cheap raw materials from diamonds, copper, gold, ivory, anything you can think of. Rubber was a huge one. African colonies were used in an exclusive market where your colony had to buy goods from the mother country, shipped from France, shipped from Great Britain, and those goods had taxes on them, had surcharges on them. They essentially made the mother country a great deal of money. African colonies and the natives were used as a source of cheap and at times just straight up slave labor, exploited for their labor. And the Europeans had worked to convert Africans to Christianity via missionaries, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Christian missionaries found their efforts arguably were most successful. The Berlin Conference of 1884, pictured in a political cartoon here, had divided Africa, or at least set the rules for the division of Africa amongst European powers. And in doing so, they did not invite any African rulers, kings, tribal chieftains, or emperors, and they did not take into account elements of African history when they did these divisions. They didn't care what tribes got grouped together or were divided by artificial boundaries. They didn't care what ethnic groups were, again, divided or grouped together based on this, or even geography. What geographic features might be lacking in some areas? Do they lack a source of water? They didn't really care. And there's Otto von Bismarck slicing into Africa as a cake and apportioning different Europeans a piece of this. Under European control, Africans were, big one, denied self-rule. I mean, the black Africans had no rule, no participation in government pretty much whatsoever. They lacked rights and liberties. They were treated at best as second-class citizens, or worse, like straight-up slaves like they were in the Belgian Congo. They resented this foreign control, as all people who are controlled do. Black Native Africans did not like being controlled by this. They weren't like, oh, yay, the Europeans are here. No, they resisted it, but a lack of technological and modern warfare proficiency in most of those countries or territories basically precluded them from being able to resist European imperialism. Black Africans lacked economic opportunities. They were stuck mostly mining, farming, or acting as servants. Mining conditions were very brutal with high injury rates, high death rates, which they still have in Africa today. And Africans that were native were limited in their access to education. Some of the colonies did see this idea, kind of like we saw in India, of elevating some tribes above others and choosing to give some level of education to them. You saw that certainly in parts of French Africa. They were commonly practicing this concept of basically building a local native elite that was educated and acculturated to your designs of imperialism and using them to control the other natives in a territory. In the 1920s, when nationalist movements are increasing their activity across the globe, Pan-Arabism, You saw definitely nationalist movements in India with the INC. You also saw Pan Africanism, a movement that promoted unity for all African people, all African tribes, all African sects and ethnicities, and to fight for independence. And it grows increasingly. Some of the elites are breaking away from colonial control and trying to look at other opportunities to win freedom. And then after World War II, you saw that many of these African colonies erupted into protest or violence demanding independence, like we saw in India as well. And so most African colonies became free nations after 1959, and certainly by 1965, the vast majority of African colonies have won their freedom and independence. And you've got a great chart here kind of showing the different dates: 62, 51, 60, 60, on which these countries won their independence. The first of these that won its own independence was the African colony of Ghana. So that used to be called the Gold Coast and was a British colony. And they began their independence in 1957, arguably in many ways led by a nationalist movement of Kwame Nkrumah. He was a highly educated, brilliant individual, brilliant political organizer, and he was deeply inspired by the acts of Mohandas Gandhi in India, who had, using nonviolence, using satyagraha, had won independence for his people. And so he's going to advocate nonviolent protests. It worked against the British in India. Why wouldn't it work against the British in Africa? And he promoted self-government now. The British hemmed and hawed and were like, yeah, let's look at a long, slow process for democratization and freedom. And he's like, no, self-government now. Africa for Black Africans. He organized strikes and boycotts like we saw in India as well. He was repeatedly imprisoned by the British government, like Gandhi was. So a lot of parallels can be drawn here. And he was ultimately successful. That, the British Empire, reeling from World War II and reeling from the loss of India, realizing they can't really hold on to their empire, frees his nation in 1957. And then he gets to become the leader. He is the first democratically elected prime minister and later president of the newly freed country of Ghana. He began a massive series of public works projects to try to industrialize, to build schools, and to try to build infrastructure. The problem was basically a lot of the Western countries were upset that they were losing their colonies. So they tended to refuse to give loans, infrastructure loans, or gave them at obnoxiously high interest rates. And so a lot of these building programs, Ghana didn't actually have the money for. And so the cost of them dealt a pretty terrific amount of damage to Ghana's economy. Another criticism of Kwame Nkrumah is that he really saw himself as like, I don't know, the future leader of a Pan-African movement, or the future leader of maybe a United States of Africa. And he spent a lot of time as prime minister and president outside of his own country, going to like conferences to promote Pan-Africanism. And so the Guyanese people, some of them thought like he was kind of abandoning them in order to promote greater African freedom and the freedom of other African countries. Eventually, the economic crisis and his somewhat unpopularity at home leads to a group of military agents thinking they can overthrow him. And there is a military coup against him about a decade after he wins freedom for Ghana, and he lives the rest of his life in exile, fleeing to another country. Today, Ghana is a regional power. They do have a more vibrant economy today. They have a functioning multi-party democracy. They've recovered from the military coups and periods of military dictatorship, and they're doing pretty well today for African countries. One of the other famous independence movements in Africa was that of Kenya, which was another British colony. The movement for independence in the British colony of Kenya was led by a nationalist named Jomo Kenyatta, and you can see him pictured here. Looks like he's trying to read my mind. And he advocated also nonviolent protests. However, at the same time he is advocating for nonviolent protests, there were some very violent rebellions by other tribal groups, the Malma Rebellion. in which ethnic Kikuyu Kenyans rebelled against British control, leading to a pretty horrific war in which the natives warred against British soldiers and also, more commonly, just massacred white civilians. They realized they couldn't be super effective against the British military, but it was still pretty easy to kill white farmers. So a lot of violence on both sides as the Kikuyu massacred British civilians. The British military would then massacre Moi Moi villages. So really, really violent. The British realizing between the nonviolent protests that are shutting down the economy and the unpopularity of this violent war against the rebellion that it's just not worth holding it on to Kenya, allowed democratic elections in 1963. Shockingly, the Kenyans voted for their own people to fill these positions in government. Jomo Kenyatta's party won and declared independence from Great Britain in 1963. The Congo, the Belgian Congo, if you remember, was finally granted independence after a brutal war against the Belgians in 1960. The Belgian government just realized they're so unpopular fighting this war. It's costing so much money, it's costing the lives of men that it's just not worth holding on to the Congo anymore. Unfortunately, the Congo is going to have a hard time building a successful democratic government because the Belgians just pull out. That's what the French do. They just leave these countries. And so immediately a brutal civil war fueled mostly by tribal differences that this tribe versus this tribe versus this tribe all fighting for resources, land, control, territory, taxation. They all want to be in charge. They don't want to be underneath another tribe, and just chaos ensued. Finally, an army officer named Mobutu Sese Seko took power in a coup in 1965. He ruled as a monstrous totalitarian ruler, really a monster for a society. He renames the country Zaire and uses widespread endemic violence and fear of violence to suppress the people, to suppress democracy, to suppress rights. And because he fought specifically against communist and socialist political parties and arrested communist leaders in his country, because almost all these countries had a communist party, he was supported by the US. We gave him lots of money and guns to keep fighting communists. He was himself incredibly corrupt, stealing billions of dollars from his government. Meanwhile, famine reigned throughout his rule. Eventually, he was finally removed from power when other neighboring countries realized this guy's just insane and invaded in what some have called the African World War, because Africa is such a large continent and it involved so many countries that it was kind of a world war in Africa. The Congo today is highly politically unstable. They've never really been able to achieve peaceful transitions of power. While the Congo is still one of the richest areas in the world in terms of sheer natural resources, they are still economically very poor. A series of civil wars from the beginning, even into civil conflict today, have disrupted entire generations' education and the development of infrastructure and proper capitalistic society, or even communist society, just society. There are relatively low levels of service, education, health, sanitation. It's not arguably a great place to live. High levels of political violence, high levels of just violence as various tribal groups armed with weapons try to exert influence, incredibly high murder rate, imprisonment rate, rape rate, high levels of corruption in the government as the ruling tribes try to squeeze every dollar they can out of taxation, pocketing money, pocketing infrastructure money. And it's still caught in a cycle of what we call today economic imperialism, that 50% of their materials and exports are sent to China for very, very low prices. And so this is a political cartoon kind of commenting on this society today where you have, a white guy before under colonialism, under imperialism, and he says colony, and he's chained up these African workers to work for them. Well, today, it's no longer white and governments or white dominated governments in charge, or European or Western, whatever you want to call them, but tribal groups that take power. They enchain the workers and enrich themselves, neo-colonialism, and they sell those products very cheaply to the West, or most commonly these days to China. So the remainder of this set of notes specifically is going to focus on South Africa, which has a very high incidence rate on the regions. It has been the focus of numerous essays in the past, and I think will continue to be a major point that the regions hammers on. So let's talk about the background and history of South Africa and apartheid. South Africa had been colonized by Europeans since the early 1600s when a relatively large number of Dutch settlers essentially settled here. And they named themselves the Boers, which means farmer, essentially, in the Dutch language. And they lived not really peacefully, but they lived under a system of mutual economic malaise, or not malaise, really, I guess, interdependence with native black Africans, but typically, as a colony, did basically exploit the natives, drove them off their land, etc. And then Great Britain invaded during the age of imperialism, and they actually fought against the white Boers. They wanted to conquer South Africa as a British colony, very, very violent, one of the first uses of concentration camps in human history. And then finally, South Africa is granted independence in two stages, 1910 and 1931. However, when we say South Africa is granted independence from Great Britain, they're still part of the British Commonwealth of Nations. And the minority, the white minority in South Africa, they wanted to make sure that despite South Africa winning independence, they would still control politics, they would still control the economy, they would still be a wealthy upper class, where black South Africans would be an exploitable class. And so the system they build is called apartheid. Highlight and star the heck out of that. Apartheid, as a translation, means a complete separation of the races. You are working and passing laws to completely separate two groups of people. There's one set of laws for one set of laws another, but they still exist theoretically in the same state or country. This was begun by the Nationalist Party, which is why I say if you ever see Nationalist Party, you can tend to think these are probably going to be terrible people. Remember, the Nazis were a nationalist party. And again, if you're calling yourself that, it's probably not a great idea. And begun extensively in 1948 after World War II, when this period of decolonization and expanding some Africans' rights in some of the colonies is happening. What apartheid is the banning of all social contact between blacks and whites. Black South Africans had no voting rights whatsoever. They had segregated public facilities, and they were forced to live on the worst land that existed. And many parts of apartheid society were based on segregation laws in the American South, because you have to remember, during this time period, yes, the American South was segregated, and it would probably be called an apartheid system, or definitely should have been called an apartheid system. And we're going to see a lot of examples in the side view here, where I try to put documents and pictures and stuff. So here's an example of this apartheidness. Danger. Natives, Indians, and coloreds. If you enter these premises at night, you will be listed as missing. Armed guards shoot on sight. Savage dogs devour the corpse. You have been warned. And the white communities in South Africa segregated themselves in these guarded communities, would shoot people on sight if they came near them. Apartheid included a vast series of discriminatory laws. This is how it's significant, focused against black South Africans. Please, in your essays, don't write African Americans. Your terms you can use are Native Africans, Native South Africans, black South Africans, because there are white South Africans as well. I played rugby against a couple of them. And so let's look at what these laws are. One, you have the passbook laws. Black South Africans were forced to carry passbooks saying where they lived, obviously their name and a photograph, where they worked and were allowed to work, and where they were allowed to travel to. And there were checkpoints across South Africa to monitor and control the movement of black South Africans. This is a way to enforce racial segregation. As part of these discriminatory apartheid laws, black South Africans could not vote. They were frequently arrested and beaten for no reason at all, or the most trivial of reasons. They had lower access to schooling and education, and they were frequently barred from owning land by a series of discriminatory laws and lending practices. And here you have more examples of the segregated society: white drinking fountain, colored drinking fountain, for use by white people. These public premises and the amenities there have been reserved for the exclusive use of whites, and then written in Dutch Afrikaneers as well. And I think you could make comparisons to these laws and the Nuremberg laws. We've got passbooks. The Jews had passbooks. We've got attempting racial segregation. The Jews in Germany under the Nazis racially segregated. Arrested, beaten, and sent into concentration camps. Lower access to school would have eventually happened, but they were just killing all of the Jews. And they did deprive Jews of property. So definitely a lot of comparisons could be made between these two systems. You got nationalist government trying to enforce what they saw as their racial future. Another element of the apartheid society were known as the homelands, sometimes nicknamed the Bantustans. So the nationalist government is like, we need to come up with ways that we can deny citizenship and equal protection of the law without coming out and saying we're denying citizenship and equal protection to Black South Africans. So they begin this homelands policy in 1959. What they did is create reserves. Think of them like reservations, like Indian reservations for Black South Africans, organizing them basically based on different tribes or language groups of Black South Africans that lived in South Africa. Eventually, they essentially said these are the only acceptable lands that Black South Africans can live in. So it's a forced migration. 3.5 million Black South Africans forced to migrate to these Bantustans. And then because they're like, no, 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 we're giving them their own countries. Like, this is their own independent country. They could be denied citizenship in South Africa. So the South Africans could claim under international law, we're not denying rights or citizenship to anyone that lives in South Africa. These Black South Africans all live in their own independent reservations. It's just legalese gimmickry to try and get around international laws and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Blacks were forbidden to live anywhere else unless they worked as servants or laborers for whites, in which case they were still limited to where they could live. And as you can see, it's not a lot of land in South Africa. The colored areas here are all the Bantustans, these homelands. And Black South Africans, who were about 75% of the population, were crowded into 14% of the land, which led to the creation of these brutal slums. Denied any type of real infrastructure. It's the worst land, can barely farm on it if you can farm on it at all. Few, if any, roads, no highways connecting them, little to no sanitation. Very infrequently did they have running water or electricity. They effectively cut these Bantustans out of, anything that could be useful to them. The best land, whether farmland or control over mining resources and rights, were reserved for the white Afrikaneers, which is another name for the Boers, the white South Africans, Afrikaner. And it was also their language, Afrikaans. In reaction to this increasing violence and discriminatory laws, a nationalist group formed, and this is the good nationalist group that are fighting for freedom. This is the African National Congress, or the ANC. Please star the heck out of that. The ANC is to South Africa as the INC was to India. They're formed in 1912 to resist white minority rule. They organized protests, strikes. They burned passbooks. They're like, oh, you're going to make me carry this? I'm burning this as a form of non-violent civil disobedience. There were, however, big arguments in the ANC, while a big core of it wanted to keep being nonviolence, wanted civil disobedience as their main tool. Another core of the ANC wanted to militarize. They said, the white Afrikaners are not going to give us freedom. We must take our freedom. So you have this bifurcation, this split within this party itself. A large portion wanting nonviolence, but a decent-sized portion saying we're going to openly rebel. That's the only way we're going to fight for our freedom. So this militarized part of the ANC urged rebellion, armed rebellion. They assaulted whites and they isolated white communities in farms, burning down small farmlands and killing the families there. They also would attack other black South Africans who they saw as collaborating. So if you worked for a white person, they saw you and you actually had like a decent job or worked for the white government. They saw you as a collaborator and they practiced what was called necklacing. This was the punishment these people did. They tied a tire around you, put your arms through it, and they lit the tire covered in gasoline on fire and executed. Very brutal way to go. So it's just a real back and forth here, kind of like we saw in India, where some Indians wanted violence, but they were guided towards nonviolence by Gandhi, which proved more effective. Apartheid as a system is characterized by extreme violence, intimidation, and censorship. The Nationalist Party of South Africa, the Afrikaners, the white minority, they used violence and intimidation to keep control. Thousands of protesters and innocent black South Africans were arrested and jailed, many of them for like life sentences or 25 years or 10 years of hard labor. They did send them to labor camps where they are breaking rocks or mining or whatever until they die. And they also created kind of like their own version of the KKK. Various white vigilante groups would pop up to, burn down black villages or, lynch people. It was very, very awful violence. And in addition to these white vigilante groups, it would also be the actual Afrikaner military, the actual South African police and military. Censorship and propaganda were used to promote the white nationalist party, saying that it's the only thing that can stop the ANC. They would unleash dogs, beatings of anyone, children didn't matter to them at all. Assaults on black communities were very, very common. And that's what they felt they were resorted to as a minority group trying to rule over a much larger population. There are specific incidents of extreme violence that we'll look at. One of the most famous of these is the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960. To protest passing of the passbook laws, 20,000 black South Africans protested outside of the Sharpeville police station. They were burning their passbooks or waving their passbooks, saying, "We will not carry these." And the police opened fire. Not with rubber bullets, they opened fire with military grade rifles, shotguns, and pistols, killing 69 peaceful protesters and wounding a further 180. So this is another example of violence against protesters, which could be compared to the Amritsar massacre. It could be compared to Tiananmen Square massacre and has been. And this obviously only led to more protests and increasing resistance because this is showing that these nationalist party does not have the best interest of the African people at heart. They truly are a violent government. The apartheid government, in reaction to these increasing protests, banned the ANC and imprisoned the majority of their members. They declared it an illegal political entity and a terrorist organization, and then started rounding up the majority of their leaders. Now, externally, the Sharpeville massacre does get reported in international news, and it really stuns and horrifies many countries in the world, including the British, who still have South Africa in the Commonwealth. And so this will begin to isolate South Africa. The fact that, as the world is changing, they're just refusing to change even a little bit is going to make the South African minority government be increasingly seen as a violent and racist government. Now, after Sharpeville, even though increasing international pressure is put on South Africa, that you guys are not a good government, you guys are violently oppressing people. The oppression of apartheid just continued, and in many cases got worse as the nationalist government more and more tried to clamp down on any attempts at freedom, any attempts at protest, any attempts at bettering the lives of black South Africans. Um, and while the violence was simmering and kept at a low boil throughout the ensuing decade and a half, it boils over once again in another massacre of unarmed protesters, even more horrific this time, known as the Soweto Uprising and Massacre of 1976. So the nationalist government in an attempt to further control the minds and the lives of the Black South Africans, passes a law that says that um, all education, even in Black South African schools, will be done only in Afrikaans language, only in the language of the white oppressors. And so, huge numbers of students allied with the ANC, the African National Congress, which was fighting to improve the rights of Black South Africans, had a youth organization and a youth branch. And they organized this massive protest. 20,000 students are going to strike against school. So they're not going to go to school. They're going to march through the streets, and they're going to end up at a sports stadium where they're going to, give speeches and discuss why they're unhappy not being taught in their native language. And these kids are shot on. The police and the military are called to stop these protests, and they just straight up open fire on unarmed school children. Not even just all teenagers, just school children, elementary, middle school, high school. 176 to 700 dead. 176 is what the white nationalist government said. 700 dead were reported in local hospitals and by family members. Another 1,000 wounded. Again, almost all of these people were under the age of, or 18 and under the age of 18. They are mostly children and young teenagers. This leads to massive protests across South Africa. And again, the military and the police are called in to crush and beat and shoot at and quell using attack dogs and fire cannons against these protests as well. And Soweto also is reported on internationally, and this leads to widespread condemnation as many countries refuse to engage with South Africa. Steve Biko, who was a prominent organizer and Black African nationalist and world-famous author, was arrested for essentially not having his passbook or his passbook, not traveling in areas where his passbook did not let him. He was beaten to death and killed in jail, murdered. And because he was an internationally known activist and an internationally known author, this also shocked the world that this guy died in police custody, chained to a chair and beaten to death. And so more and more South Africa is running this internal system of apartheid and alienating the rest of the world. Onto the scene will emerge several key leaders of the ANC and or a quest to end apartheid. And one of these individuals who had tremendous international influence was Desmond Tutu. So he was a South African Anglican bishop. So he's a member of, technically it's the Church of England, but it's the Anglican Church. And he's a high up member. He's a bishop, very, very powerful in the church. And he organizes against apartheid. He's like, yeah, we're gonna organize against apartheid. We're gonna arrange protests. But as a Christian, he believes in nonviolence. And so he says, okay, well, I've got to figure out other ways to convince this Afrikaner, this white government, that apartheid's not in their best interests. So he travels internationally to many other countries, meeting world leaders, speaking to parliaments and legislatures across the world, and brought evidence with him to increase knowledge in other countries about the wrongs of apartheid. And what he helps organize, and I'd like you to star this, is a massive and international, multiple country involved economic boycott of South Africa. He says, okay, you can't function as a government without a functioning economy. I'm going to put economic pressure on this nationalist government. Once factories start shutting down, once even the whites are going out of work, they'll demand change too. And if the only way that we'll, remove these economic boycotts and sanctions on South Africa is to end apartheid, then that should be a powerful tool in our toolbox. So what he did was encourage other countries to not buy South African goods, and it was successful. Many countries refused to buy any goods produced or sourced from South Africa. He also, and this is kind of a neat one, he also argued for divestment. So divestment is the opposite of investment. When you take and you buy stocks in a South African mining consortium, or you buy stocks in a South African shipping consortium or company. And he says, no, if you have stocks, sell them for rock bottom price and no longer invest in South Africa. And this causes what's called capital flight as money leaves South Africa and these companies' stocks drop. And it very badly hurt the apartheid nationalist government, and it very badly hurt the South African economy. Now, it did hurt the economy of black South Africans too, because they worked in the mines and they worked in the service sectors. And if you're a rich, upper middle class white Afrikaner, the first thing you're going to do when you have to cut corners is fire all your servants. But it also really, for the first time ever, made some damage and some impact on the daily life of white Afrikaners, where they're realizing, holy cow, like people are getting laid off. Holy cow, like my dad can't find work, or my brother got laid off, or this and that. For his actions trying to achieve political change in a peaceful manner, Desmond Tutu won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984. And he got this great political cartoon, The People's Power, and a fist is smashing apartheid. Don't support apartheid. Now, the other key and crucial figure of the anti-apartheid movement and the ANC is Nelson Mandela. And he is a world famous individual. For a background of who he is a South African lawyer, so he did receive a law degree, and he becomes an anti-apartheid revolutionary. He wants to end the oppression of black South Africans, and eventually he becomes a major leader of the ANC, founding the ANC Youth League in 1944. Throughout his life, he was arrested many times, leading protests. And then this culmination arrest was the Rivonia trial. In 1962, he and a variety of other ANC leaders were arrested in this very famous trial in Rivonia, South Africa, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment. It is at this point in his life that Nelson Mandela had started to shift away from nonviolence, and along with a small group of ANC counter-revolutionaries, had started using targeted bombings. I would like to be very clear here. They would make sure the bombings targeted empty buildings. They would bomb infrastructure like electrical plants. They would bomb things like that, and they would essentially generally make sure no one was in the building. That sometimes they would call warning that a bombing was going to happen so people could be evacuated, and then they'd blow up the infrastructure. And that's what he was charged with. He ends up serving 27 years in a hard labor prison camp called Robbins Island. It was like Alcatraz, where no one could get on or off the island. And while in prison, he begins to advocate only for civil disobedience, only for nonviolence. He says, I'm here because I reject apartheid control, and I think, the best thing for our movement is to follow in the footsteps of Mohandas Gandhi, to follow in the footsteps of Ghana Nkrumah, to follow in the footsteps of other individuals in the nonviolent sphere. And he becomes a symbol of the injustice of apartheid. He acts as this rallying point or this focus for the apartheid movement, where they printed T-shirts and had slogans and had signs, "Free Nelson Mandela, free Mandela. He's unjustly imprisoned. Free Nelson Mandela." So while in prison, he really becomes to represent this nonviolence, civil disobedience path. These are countries that dealt with them, isolated economically. Increasingly, these boycotts, this divestment was crushing their economy. The trade restrictions, the economic sanctions, everything was causing their economy to plummet. They were even kicked out of the Olympics since the 1960s, because the Olympics are about brotherhood or humanhood of mankind or humankind, and you can't be, this terrible apartheid state and be a part of the Olympics. And here's another great slogan and political cartoon: "Free South Africa now, divest now, break economic links with apartheid." And that was thought to be a step to winning freedom for black South Africans, and it was successful. Internal reasons for apartheid's end: economy was declining. As we neared the late 80s and early 90s, mass unrest, mass protests. There was increasingly violence as part of these protests, where, again, that militant arm of the ANC were using violence. Like, the majority of the ANC was not, but the militant arm was getting increasingly scary to many whites. And in this stage of political turmoil and economic turmoil, a new president is elected. F.W. de Klerk, pictured here in 1989. And he, ran on the platform of, I am going to make sure that our economy recovers. I'm going to get rid of these boycotts. I'm going to get rid of these sanctions. I'm going to stop the divestment. I'm going to end South Africa's isolation. And at that point, the economy was bad enough that people are like, all right, then we're going to vote for you. He then immediately takes actions that he thinks will be a step towards ending South Africa's isolation. He legalizes the African National Congress, saying, nope, this is a recognized political party. They have the right to organize themselves. They have the right to have political candidates. He freed Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners from jail. And he convinced the parliament and pushed through repealing apartheid laws. And they slowly dismantled the apartheid system. Segregation is dismantled over the period of a year and a half. And then he had continuous negotiations with Nelson Mandela to hold truly open elections in which all races would be allowed to vote. After years of negotiations, South Africa holds its first truly open elections in 1994. And Nelson Mandela wins, overwhelmingly in this next election, becoming the country's first black president, with F.W. de Klerk as his vice president. For his role in negotiating these open elections, for his role in acting as this martyr in political imprisonment in a labor camp for 27 years, Mandela was known as Madiba, father of the nation. The ANC also won majority control in parliament and would get to oversee lawmaking. And since then, they have never really lost a election. They've always had control of parliament ever since then. Nelson Mandela and de Klerk won the Nobel Peace Prize jointly for bringing democracy and ending apartheid in South Africa. They created a new constitution in 1996 with a Bill of Rights based on the United States that embraced many parts of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declaring guaranteed rights for all groups, no matter race, creed, or color of skin. Nelson Mandela promoted his concept of the Rainbow Nation. When the black South Africans took power under Nelson Mandela and the ANC, there were a lot of black South Africans who wanted to punish the white minority for decades of abuse and violence, who wanted to drive all whites out of South Africa, seize all their land, kick them out, put them on a boat, see you later. And Nelson Mandela, whether he's right or wrong is up to you, but he argues that that's not what South Africa should be about. That it should be a country that embraces all races, all religions, all people, and does not discriminate. I think also intelligently, he looked at other countries in Africa that, upon winning independence, had attacked, punished, or driven out their white communities, and saw how economically unviable their economies became because of the capital and brain drain that led to. And so I think there was probably some calculation on his mind as well. So his idea of a rainbow nation says we're not going to have discrimination. We're not going to punish. South Africa, government and politics will be open to all. The rights and protections will be given to all. But we do have to address the wrongs of apartheid. So he creates what's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we're going to explore in a second to try to address the violence of apartheid. But because he tried to include everyone instead of punishing, Nelson Mandela did set the stage for South Africa to become one of the strongest and wealthiest nations in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the other sub-Saharan Africa nations, they're not doing great. Instead, South Africa, well, perhaps not equally, was able to move forward. And so we got a great quote: "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin, his background, or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." And then you have another great cartoon: "Equality, human dignity, and freedom of expression," reading out of the new South African Constitution. And Mandela says, "Excellent vocabulary. Now let's go out and make it happen." So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a bit of a mixed legacy. The goal of this was to address and to acknowledge that apartheid had human rights abuses. It also wanted to acknowledge that human rights abuses were conducted by both sides, by the militant arm of the ANC murdering and massacring white farmers or killing their own people, killing other black South Africans who were collaborators, as well as obviously identifying, acknowledging the abuses of police and the military and these vigilante groups, these white vigilante groups. And what they did is allowed people to give and hear testimony on these abuses and to ask for forgiveness. And they wanted to avoid this idea that now that the blacks were in power, that it was victor's justice, right? That was a big criticism of the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, that now that the blacks, quote unquote, won, they're going to go out and punish everyone else and put them on trial. So over the course of 4 years, they have over 1,000 international hearings with translators there. There were 7,000 applications for amnesty for crimes. About 1,000 of them were granted, but another 6,000 saw some jail time. But the overall legacy is many black South Africans felt that this commission was a bad alternative, that justice, actually arresting people for murders, actually arresting people and sentencing them to jail, would have been a better exercise of justice. So it's got this mixed legacy. And you've got Desmond Tutu, by the way, was one of the leading members of these hearings. And you have truth and reconciliation, and there's no middle ground. That the truth was heard, but justice was not served. And to many black South Africans, that was how they felt about truth and reconciliation. How's South Africa doing today? They have a strong economy for a sub-Saharan African nation. They still have access to resources such as gold and some diamonds. They're a member of BRICS, a major economic grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They have continuously had democratic elections and peaceful transitions of power, but the ANC, since Mandela, has increasingly been accused of widespread corruption. That the leaders of the ANC use their political positions to enrich themselves, their families, and their friends, essentially stealing money from the South African government. So that's one downside, one drawback of the society. Another one is the remaining achievement gap, that even though apartheid is over and even though black South Africans have had a majority in parliament, have held the presidency every single year since 1994, there still remains a huge divide between life quality for whites and life quality for blacks in South Africa. Whites tend to have higher educational outcomes and opportunities. They have better economic opportunities. Land was not redistributed, so the whites still own a lot of the land and the best land. Property, business ownership, business success, business profitability, all still in the hands, or a lot of it's still in the hands of the whites because it wasn't taken away from them. And I'm not advocating that it should be, but when not a lot gets changed except for just to bring in a new government, it might be one of the reasons why this achievement gap remains. South Africa has also had to deal with a massive HIV infection rate and AIDS death rate, as well as relatively high violence rates. South Africa typically is between the third and fifth most violent countries in the world between murder and rape rates. So we got a couple cartoons kind of criticizing this. You have apartheid as a tree that's been cut down. Well, that should do it, says the white guy. The black South African understands that the roots of hate and discrimination are far deeper. You have a white farmer, a Boer here, drinking a Cape wine, a fine, balanced, complex blend, and then the worker, and the majority of workers are still black South Africans, with a hint of slavery and lingering apartheid aftertaste. That this economy is not really diversified. Summing it all up, African colonies began to actively seek independence from Europe after World War II, a major turning point. Pan-Africanism and self-rule nationalism increased and helped collapse these empires, specifically the French, the British. Ghana was the first to become free. Kenya, Congo, and many others followed, most winning their freedom by 1965. In South Africa, a white minority created apartheid, a system of racist and racial segregation to maintain control. Nelson Mandela, Modiba, the father of his nation, was a agent of the ANC, the African National Congress, working to end apartheid. Was jailed for 27 years. Entered negotiations to be a part of the ending of apartheid, and along with the President F.W. de Klerk, finally led to this system being put away for good, at least the actual legal system of apartheid. Mandela's desire to seek peace and reconciliation instead of punishment as part of his Rainbow Nation did help South Africa recover. And so that is our exploration of South Africa. We're going to look at modern African problems in our next set of notes.